Hello, welcome to International Relations, POS 360. Um, this is conversation on Chapter 5, the State and Tools of Statecraft. Again, this is your instructor, Stephen Mabu. So today we'll be examining the state and tools of statecraft, and I want us to deliberate on what the state is, how it's organized, some of the tools that it uses in statecraft, and we'll go from there. So these are the learning objectives. We want to understand the state, to understand the tools of statecraft, what the state's power issues from, and sort of look at the different theoretical approaches and sort of figure out how to make sense of the state and its power and some of its challenges. So in terms of definition, the state is defined based on a number of characteristics. These include territory, so it has to have territory that is actually recognized as its own. That territory should be bounded by borders, a stable population that normally resides within the borders, so not transient, even though states like Qatar would qualify as a state, even though about 70% of the population is transient. The population owes allegiance to the government of the day, and the government so constituted is actually effective. So we shall later on look at failed states and so on. There's also the requirement for recognition, so diplomatic recognition by other states. And so countries such as Kosovo, the Palestinian Authority, may not qualify as states under these criteria. However, we're going to actually look at other criteria that define a people, such as a nation. So for example, people who share the same characteristics, American Indian nations are examples. But also when the nation and the state share the same borders, then we call that the nation state. So these maps are intended to assist states to think about what these entities have in common. So for example, the United States, Tanzania, Iraq, and Canada, and are best used alongside another set of maps. This set of maps, Swaziland or Eswatini these days, Japan, Somalia, and Finland. And so the first set of countries, let's call them countries, are what would be called states. And this is a set of nation states. So the nation occupies the same borders as the state, even though Somalia has populations that are resident in Kenya and in Djibouti and Ethiopia. And so the United States, Canada, Iraq, and Tanzania are examples of states. Swaziland, Eswatini, Japan, Finland, and Somalia are examples of nation states. And so here are some more examples of nations without international recognition. One such example is Palestine. So Palestine, the Arab part of the partition of 1947, and so the Palestinian National Authority has authority over West Bank, and Hamas has had authority over Gaza. In Kenya and Tanzania, you find a similar situation. So you find, for example, the Maasai peoples of Kenya and Tanzania who go back and forth across the borders. There is another example, that is the Kurds who are found to be in Iraq, Iran, Armenia, and Turkey, and so they are a nation without a state. And so these are some examples of how nations can be without states, but the people who live within there are actually they consider themselves members of a state. Now, moving forward, so for example, Kurdistan, as we mentioned, is one such state that is really a nation without a state. And of course, the Kurds have been agitating for recognition, but then the question would be, where would a Kurdish state arise from? So Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, perhaps not as much Georgia, but and also Iran, but you can sort of see that creating a Kurdish nation would require the splitting up of, for example, these countries. And so again, if you think about their total number, which numbers about 30 million, and they also see themselves as different from, for example, the Turks, the Arabs in places like Iraq, but also being of a different religion, this further magnifies their place. We mentioned Palestine again. So think about the relationship between a state and a nation. Nation states would be, for example, Denmark and Italy, where most people speak the language and live within those borders. There are nations that are spread in several states, like the Kurds in Iraq, Somalis in Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Djibouti, also the Maasais. But also think about states that have several nations within their borders, such as India, Russia, and the US, particularly in the US with the Native American populations, or Native American Indian nations. And so in many of these places, including, for example, Russia, you'll find federal arrangements with some sort of recognition and acknowledgement of the state, of the nation within the state. But we also find a prevalent sort of disruptive force that is often considered or known by the term of irredentism, which is where individuals join with others with whom they share a nation to try and create a state that, you know, encompasses those borders. So, for example, the Kurds, the Somalis are examples of irredentist groups. So sometimes it's a challenge to have different nations within who are spread across borders. Because, for example, if you think of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the questions, for example, of Albanian Muslims, Serbians, and so on, and where they were located. Another example to think of is, for example, the Somalis, who are, if they were to make a nation, that would be what the nation would look like. So they are located in Kenya, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, and they consider themselves Somalis as a nation, but it is spread across a number of countries. Other examples would be, for example, Germans who have in the past been located inside of countries such as Germany, Austria, parts of Poland. And so if you think about Hitler's activities, his idea was to have all German nationals within one or two, sort of take over all the nations that had German peoples. Other places, for example, even though sometimes it might be difficult to sort of think about this in the context of how do you tell one Canadian from another. Of course, this is probably more generalization, but the Quebec region where the Quebecois see themselves as a French-leaning ethno-nationalist group, and actually voted on whether they were going to secede. But even less challenging regions such as California, the question of whether California is the same, and some people will look to ideology, ideas, conservatism, political beliefs, and so on, separating the even members of the same body politic. So the Californias would probably split into Northern California, Central California, and Southern California, based on these perceived differences. But so we now come to the question of how do, from a theoretical perspective, what are the differences in how the different people see. So from the realist perspective, the state is a unitary autonomous actor that has to operate within the constraints of the international system, or the anarchy of the international system. The state is a sovereign. Its primary guiding light is the national interest, which are conceived in terms of power and security, while the liberal view is that the state is a process with many rival interests. So think of interest groups, governmental and societal interests, and so it is often seen as a repository of multiple and changing national interests. It has fungible power, but more importantly, it's an aggregator of interests, and so there's not one single national interest. It's almost like all these interests amongst the members who live within the state are aggregated to create the state. The radical view of the state is that it is the executing agent of the bourgeoisie. So again, the radical view stems from Marxism, and so this will have something to do with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And so the state is influenced by the pressures of the capitalist class, even though it is also constrained by the pressures of in the structure of the international capitalist system. But so in the pursuit of resources for the bourgeoisie class, the state can seek to expand, but also it finds itself stratified within the international economic system. For the realists, the state is a socially constructed entity, but it's also, as realists view, or rather as constructivists view the world as that processes, political processes, are constructed, so is the state. The state can be shaped by both internal and external norms that change preferences, and so these norms and interests are changing, but also the state can be socialized both internally and externally, particularly by international norms. States enjoy power, and power, there's a couple of definitions of power. So ability to influence behavior and control outcomes, or the power of A to get B to do something they otherwise wouldn't do, absent the coercion. And these different types of power, so natural, tangible, intangible, and so the state seeks to exercise this power. In terms of, so the precise definition, which is probably more conceptual, the ability of A to get something, the ability of A to get B to do something they wouldn't otherwise do at an acceptable cost to them. And power takes the forms of military, economic, rational, cultural, persuasive, technological. Military, economic, rational, cultural, persuasive, and technological. And so if you sort of think about this in the traditional concept of power, there's the hard power, which is military and economic. We have seen emerging notions, for example, of soft power. So the ability to persuade others, so persuasive, cultural, and perhaps rational. We also see technological power, which often then builds into the military and economic. So think about GPS being used worldwide, or think about technological power, radio being used to broadcast or movies. So they are interchangeable. But we also see new emergent concepts. So for example, soft power, which is contrary to hard power, doesn't seek to utilize the military. There's smart power, which is often seen as a mix of both soft power and hard power. Cohen and I talk about interdependence or complex interdependence, which is also meshed into globalization. But we also see, and maybe this is not the same kind of concept, the responsibility to protect. In other words, the conception of the state and its obligations. In terms of returning for a moment to power, so there are tangible and intangible sources of power. So for example, industrial development, economic diversification, infrastructure, and military characteristics. So sort of like the hard power sources. And so for example, the industrial capacity, it can alter disadvantages of geography, even though sometimes it really can't influence them. Population can be important, because you have to have people to do the work, but also as Qatar has shown, but also even with immigration and other elements of population exchanges, they can change the sources of power. There are intangible sources of power, so for example, national image, government quality, public support, cohesion, leadership, morale, and so on. But also when such power is put to attraction, so think about maybe places people want to go see Disney, go see, I don't know, Paris, Eiffel Tower. And so some states do become attractive for settlement, living, working, and so on. And as I mentioned, the smart power being the effective combination of soft power and hard power. There are innate characteristics of a state that can predispose it to natural sources of power. So for example, the geographic size and position, that is the territory, but also territory can be imbued with natural resources. And so if you also think about, for example, the role of space in geography, Napoleon and Hitler were defeated by the space and geography and maybe environmental characteristics. But also, while this can be positive, they can also be negative in that they can be indefensive, they can contain choke points. So for example, if you have ports and those kinds of things. Other sources of power could be, for example, oil, population, and so think about the total populations and look at these as sources of labor. But also sometimes it can be a strain on the economy if, for example, you have a middle class of 400 million in a place like India, but sort of think about the total population of 1.4 billion. Power can be expressed differently. So for example, think about the power of industry. And so, for example, these cars being made in Japan but being on sale in Germany illustrates sources of economic power. There are other sources of power. So, for example, industrial development, economic diversification, infrastructure, and military characteristics. And so, if you think about, they also capacities for internal markets. So for example, the US, with air travel, the reduction of geography and costs, but also developing the ability to develop products that find an internal market. But also if you have large but poorly equipped armies, so again, this may not overcome the question of economic resources. So this sort of gives us some insight into ingredients of state power. So natural sources of power being geography, natural resources and population. Tangible sources of power being industrial development, infrastructure, and the military. But intangible sources of power can include the national image, public support, and leadership. So, as I previously mentioned, there's a difference between hard power, so various sources of power to either advance oneself or to coerce others, so military, economic, and technological, while soft power is really focused on trying to persuade others. And so when others' actions are perceived as legitimate and attractive, setting examples that others can emulate. And so things like democracy, things like, and sometimes it can be as unspecific as the NFL playing in Europe, or when an individual goes to a foreign country and they can identify Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Domino's, or other things that are sometimes connected to the United States. Now, of course, power has its limits, and some of these limits include what countries can reasonably do even when they have this military power. And one great example is given during the 1991 Gulf War, where it is said that Saudi Arabia was willing to welcome US troops on condition that they did not bring alcohol into the country. And so even though the US had arguably the most substantive military, a country can still be required to do certain things or to not do certain things. But we also see examples of the limitations of power. So for example, despite its great power, the US is unable to control the drug production in Mexico, but also the engagements in the Middle East. Sometimes you can't really coerce countries to do what you want to do, and so this is what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. But also power doesn't lend itself to controlling the collateral damage that comes out of certain things. Now, when we think about states and their instruments of power, we think about how this is applied. And so it can be applied through diplomacy, through economic statecraft, or through force. But for all these to work, or either of them to work, you have to have credibility, the ability and incentive to act or fail to act in a certain way, but also to convince the other side that this is likely to be carried out or not carried out. And the lack of ability or incentive may make the policy not credible. One of the best examples that has been highlighted in the past maybe 10 years is Obama's red line with the use of chemical weapons in Syria. If you do say you're going to do something and then you don't actually do it, what does that mean? Or what does that imply for credibility of your actions? And so yeah, there's these limitations in what countries can do, but also we sort of move on to think about the art of diplomacy, which by definition is the practice of trying to influence other states' behaviors by bargaining, negotiating, taking specific non-coercive actions, refraining from actions, or appealing to foreign public support, but also maybe also undertaking certain actions. And so if you think about if you think about traditional diplomacy, you're influencing others' behaviors, you're taking or not taking action, and you're appealing to a foreign public. You can use positive images, so attractiveness of your position to those people, but also requires you to be credible with believable statements, likely, and ability to back up your positions with actions, whether you're threatening or coercing or inviting. Now, sometimes these can be complicated by perceptions of things like credibility, but also by loss of face. So if the other party thinks that it is better to lose face than to actually cave in, then these culture-bound activities can be influential on how diplomacy is applied. And so, as Nicholson suggests, diplomacy begins with negotiation, and this can be direct or indirect. So, for example, Switzerland has been one of the most famous pathways to communication indirectly. For example, during the Iranian embassy hostage crisis and many other crises around the world. But so think about the two or more parties that are negotiating, and each knows its power, its potential, its goals, and sometimes has an idea of the opponent's goals and power potential. This is especially seen, for example, during the 1923 Washington Treaty, I believe, where the US was actually reading Japanese codes and kind of knew what their position was and what they would agree to, but this is not always the case. And this is illustrated in that information on the opponent may be imperfect, incomplete, or just wrong. Think about the allegation that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction before 2003. And sometimes with the negotiation, each party has to think about what's their worst position, what's their best position or their best outcome, and maybe what they are willing to accept and what they are not willing to accept. Sometimes there are negotiations that parties will not accept, no matter how aggregate they might be, because of cultural reasons and leadership reasons that might not be acceptable. But again, it's not always that both parties will be pleased by the outcomes of negotiations, and this has to be sort of thought out. And so sometimes we bring in the diplomacy as two-level games. So complex processes, two levels that are going on simultaneously, so international levels of negotiation, but also domestic levels of negotiations, even though this might be more credible and apparent in societies that have domestic audiences that have an impact on government structures and decisions. So if you're talking about, say, North Korea, it's not clear that this might necessarily, the two-level games might actually apply. But so when negotiating, the negotiation is important, but also ratifying the agreement and then maybe implementing it. Which brings us to two tracks of diplomacy. And so these two tracks of diplomacy include track one, which is public diplomacy, and track two, which is sort of person-to-person diplomacy. And so the track two diplomacy is usually sort of informational, cultural, and so on, and may be carried out by individuals. And so even though now this track has sort of diminished considerably, think of, for example, China's Confucius institutes. But so track 2 diplomacy is generally not directly linked to the state, and so might include, for example, Bill Richardson, or for example, Bill Clinton getting American journalists from North Korea, or someone like Dennis Rodman going to North Korea and interfacing with the leader. Speaking of Dennis Rodman. And so sometimes this can be successful. Other examples I've included, for example, Carter Center, the International Negotiation Networks, informal meetings, but also things like Peace Corps to create goodwill. But again, sometimes this can backfire. As an example, Blood of the Condor was almost a major backfire on the US. So informal diplomacy, you see, for example, the US, Mexico, and Canada negotiating in a formal agreement to create or to replace NAFTA with USMCA. And so this would be an example of formal diplomacy. So track 2 diplomacy can be successful, as we mentioned, and may include individuals who are well known. So, for example, Bill Richardson, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Peace Corps volunteers, and so on. But besides negotiation, there is other tools that states have, and so these are economic statecraft. So positive sanctions or engagement, or negative sanctions. And so think of this as carrots and sticks. And so carrots entice states to move in a certain direction that the other party desires. And so this is based on positive incentives. So they might include something like trading privileges, like the most favored nation being allowed to buy sensitive products. So for example, the US F-35 joint fighter, which certain countries have been allowed to buy, or giving corporations investment guarantees or tax breaks. And as we mentioned, the most favored nation status. Of course, there are negative sanctions which threaten punishment. So, for example, freezing assets, boycotts, for example, apartheid South Africa, trade limits being imposed, but also freezing assets, comprehensive sanctions, or even not allowing people to travel. And so these are examples of instruments of economic statecraft. So positive engagement, but also negative engagement. So for example, US prohibiting certain sales of components to China or to Russia would be example of negative sanctions. Now, sometimes they can be cheaper, although they have unintended consequences. Almost always when a state imposes sanctions on another, particularly with products, it's often the citizenry that hurts. So for example, imposition of medicines or those kinds of things, and they do not always hurt the intended groups. And so, for example, the Somalia ban on charcoal industry hurts the ability of poor populations to access nutrition and so on. But also sometimes you can find that maybe engaging with the regime might be more productive than excluding it, and this is maybe what has occurred in Cuba. And so Cuba is an example where the statecraft, economic statecraft has worked, even though, again, this has been imposed by the US to punish Fidel Castro. Again, the question of this strategy is questionable because the US has not imposed a similar sanction on, for example, China, which is also communist. And so this has been the longest trade embargo in history, even though countries in the neighborhood did not necessarily do that. And so, because Cuba did not transition into what the US desired, can we say the sanctions failed? But also the other countries declined to impose sanctions because they didn't think that it was in their preview to decide what kind of government Cuba was going to have. And so when we think about sanctions, we think of the use of force or the threat to use force, which is compellence or deterrence. So you compel people to do something or undo something that has already been done. So for example, the US sought to compel Iraq to leave Kuwait, but that actually didn't happen. And sometimes the use of force can be in deterrence, and so punishing a state if they have taken action that was undesired. But these both require communication, they also require credibility that you're actually going to do what you say you're going to do. So nuclear weapons can be both compellence and deterrence, but the question is, do they make a state safer? Or do they make it more likely to be attacked by others, which now maybe perceive it as at an advanced state? Now, we could talk about Mueller's essential irrelevance of nuclear weapons, that maybe 1995 article. But also, we have seen India and Pakistan go to war while they both had nuclear weapons and did not use them. And so the question is, why is that they fought a conventional war when they had nuclear weapons? Maybe nuclear weapons are irrelevant, maybe. But states seek nuclear weapons and they communicate objectives and capabilities and sometimes willingness to go the distance. But they has, other than the US that used atomic weapons, no other country has ever used them, and so there's questions of how well can the idea that we can compel or deter countries using nuclear weapons work. Now, there's a difference between autocracies and democracies when it comes to foreign policy. And so the idea is that, according to Immanuel Kant, democracy changes international politics by eliminating war, because the public restrains the leaders, and the leaders are likely to pay a penalty for starting war. And so some of this can be seen to be attributable to the democratic peace theory, that no two democracies have ever gone to war with each other. Even though they fight, autocracy is just the same. And so this, the idea that democracies are not more pacifist than non-democracies, because if they are negotiating with other democracies, they have visibility. But then again, there's a question of what is a democracy. The US is said to have been a democracy since 1822, and that is not necessarily well known to have been the case. But democracies often support each other and create. But so we have to ask ourselves about their relations between states. How do states make decisions about their relations with other states? And so there's quite a number of models of foreign policy decision making. So, for example, there are those models that see the state as a unitary actor. Actually, realism does that. But also there are those decision models that look at the state as composed of multiple actors, but also the state as a rational actor. And so sometimes when the rational actor model or rational actor theory is used, the crisis situation, short time to act, and incomplete information about other states revert to the state as a rational actor. And so we have previously talked about the rational choice theory, rational actor model, making a decision, choices, preferences, transitivity of the preferences, valid alternatives, maximization of utility through computation of the optimal decision, doing a cost-benefit analysis, and then acting rationally and repeating after implementing the decision. And so this is an example of, rationality as applied to the People's Republic of China against the Republic of China in 1996 with the threat of weapons testing. So there's another model of decision making in foreign policy, that is the organizational process model. And so this is based on standard operating procedures, or SOPs, and how the decisions are made based on precedent, incrementally, consistency or lack thereof in decision making, because different organizations have different processes, and so this may differ. There's also the bureaucratic politics model, which is, if you think about the different bureaucracies, departments and groups and individuals, they have different goals and outcomes. So for example, the State Department might want to achieve peace, while the Pentagon is, or Department of Defense is geared for war. So these are two competing potential outcomes. And so these are not necessarily always very efficient decision making. And so this is a graphic representation of the bureaucratic and organizational model of decision making. So organizations, subunits use the standard operating procedures. The bureaucracies use bargaining based on different interests. And so, for example, the State Department versus Defense Department would have different outcomes, but they're advising the same commander-in-chief, and so what are they likely to do? So decisions may depend on precedent, changes unlikely, conflict can occur between different groups, and same with the departments, because they would have different decisions and outcomes and goals. And so if you think about some of these, so for example, the trade bureaucracies, such as in trade, agriculture, industry, and labor have different outcomes and goals, but also with environment, economics, labor, and the environment have different policies that are favorable to their groups, and so we find quite a bit of satisficing. The pluralist model is one that takes the role of societal groups in influencing national decisions, and these play very important roles for the policies that are adopted by states. So for example, if you think of the Israeli APAC, American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or other trade and international groups, and so governments will be looking at these diverse interests, and so the pluralist model will look at all these different groups, such as interest groups, MNCs, public opinion, mass movements, other things like history, and then the leaders will make a decision. And so there's quite a bit of decision, or rather bargaining, amongst the domestic actors. And so often this is used in non-crisis, mostly economic decisions. And so there's mobilization of different resources and pathways to influence the decisions. Now, according to the constructivist models of decision making, we think about things like interpretation of current norms, historical experiences, socialization norms, and cultural differences. For example, there are societies that are more prone to war. So, for example, the Australian versus Canadian decisions on the Iraq war, where Australia continues supporting, but Canada stopped supporting. And so the history, culture, geography, values, and experience and traditions become more important in deciding what the country will do. But so when we think about state and foreign policy, what the state is, and how it approaches its relations with others. We also have to think about the challenges to the state, such as globalization, transnational crime, transnational movements, and ethno-national movements, and how the state has to contend with this, but also the globalization of negative experiences such as AIDS, SARS, avian flu, Zika, but also now COVID. And so sort of like the challenges that are imposed by even media, for example, the size of Facebook's reach, which is more than 2 billion people. And so the state finds its authority undermined, but also we find the increasing importance and actions of the violent non-state or transnational state, non-state actors such as ISIS, Hamas in its actions, and so on. But we also see transnational extremist movements such as Islamic fundamentalist movements that seek to establish caliphates and so on. And so all these are challenges to but also within weak states. The question of ethno-nationalist movements, national subgroups, and secessionist movements, but also ethnic uprisings and so on, and how they can influence, change, affect the state, but also how they might lead to conflict between nuclear armed states. Transnational crime, of course, is a growing challenge. Transportation and new communication technologies and routes, for example, fentanyl being ordered, or pills being ordered on Snapchat or other social media sites, but also the ease of movement in illegal drugs, counterfeit goods, laundered money, smuggled weapons, and so on. But also the increasing yeah.
You have one? Okay. Just
so some states have become sponsors of and active participants in some of these transnational crimes. We also see the rise of fragile, failed, and failing states, which pose internal and external threats. So hideaways for transnational terrorists and pirates, but also some of the challenges that they can bring about. The failed states such as South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, DRC, Libya, and so on. But especially when there's then, for example, pandemics in those countries such as cholera in Yemen or Ebola in DRC, and their challenges. So these are some of the things that we have to think about when we think about state power in policy, and how they affect the stability of the world that we inhabit. Hopefully you find these discussions useful, important. Next time we shall talk about war.